Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. I must admit to you all that I have doctored the lectionary this Advent season. As many of you know, but perhaps some don't, the lectionary is a 3-year cycle of prescribed readings for worship that follows the liturgical seasons. There's Advent stories at Advent, Christmas stories at Christmas, Easter stories at Easter, etc., etc. But we have 4 Gospels, so there's lots of different stories for each season. And the lectionary tries to mix it up, so we're not hearing the exact same stories every year, which is a good idea, or so I thought. See, I used to think that all lectionary years were created equal until I looked at this year's Advent readings. Advent is my favorite time of the liturgical year. There's hope and joy and expectancy and babies and friendly animals ready to welcome the Christ child into the world. Wonderful, beautiful, tidings of comfort and joy for all. Except not, apparently, during lectionary year A, that's this year, where it seems that someone went through all the Advent stories and took out all the baby stuff. Like, how do you do that? That's the whole point of the story. But somehow they did. We started Advent with the end times and Jesus saying, "Keep awake, for the Son of Man will come like a thief in the night." Then last week, we had John the Baptist calling us the spawn of snakes. This week was supposed to be John the Baptist again, and then next week we get a little bit of the baby stuff, but it's hearsay, and it's not exactly joyful. It's an angel saying, "Hey, Joseph, I got a little news. Your betrothed is pregnant, and the baby's not yours. But listen, don't leave her." I do see the divine humor in all of this. For 2 years, I've been preaching all the baby texts while receiving and holding my own bad news. Now that I can finally celebrate Advent with some good news on the baby front, the lectionary has gone as barren as Elizabeth's aging womb. Indeed, God does have a sense of humor. But 2 can play at that game. So, dear friends, fear not. I've imported this morning's gospel readings from lectionary year C. The story of Mary and Elizabeth, complete with Mary's song of praise, the Magnificat. And oh, what a story it is. This morning's 2 gospel readings are the heart of the Advent season. We've got not just one miraculously pregnant woman, but 2. Elizabeth is geriatric, and Mary is allegedly a virgin. These 2 women come together to share wonder and joy at the marvelous things that God has done. And their joy is so visceral that even the babies in utero get in on the action. And then Mary bursts into song. She sings of how the God who has done wondrous things for her will continue to do wondrous things for all God's people. How God scatters the proud and brings down the powerful, but lifts up the lowly. How God fills the hungry with good things, but sends the rich away empty. How God is faithful from generation to generation and never gives up on God's people. You know, I imported Mary and Elizabeth this year for my own sake. Yes, it's true, but also because this story is bursting at the seams with good news. And I think we need some good news right now. There is so much bad news around us, so much King Herod and Pontius Pilate, so much of death-dealing rulers preying on people who are vulnerable and poor. And the Christmas story is full of that as well, don't get me wrong. But on this third Sunday of Advent, when we light the candle of joy, we do well to remember that in the middle of all this darkness, there are also two women filled with the unlikeliest of pregnancies, singing in the Judean hill country for joy. That's the other thing that gets me about Mary and Elizabeth, the timing of their joy. Someone reading this story from a purely rational perspective could argue that these women are rejoicing prematurely. Elizabeth is 6 months pregnant. That's pretty far along. But she hasn't earned the title barren without her share of losses, of hopes raised only to be dashed again. Add that to the risks associated with pregnancy and childbirth in the ancient world, and at her age, there is still plenty that could go horribly wrong. And yet, Elizabeth rejoices. Likewise with Mary, though her problem is of a slightly different nature. She is a teenage girl, engaged to be married, but here she is pregnant, and the baby is sure not Joseph's. She doesn't yet know how the story goes. We do. She's not yet read the part where Joseph listens to the angel, where he marries her and raises the child as his own. As far as Mary is concerned, she is in a precarious position. She could have come to Elizabeth's house to share her joy, but she might also be running away from home, trying to conceal a quickly growing secret. Mary and Elizabeth are still very much in the messy middle of this story. And yet they come together and rejoice. They rejoice while it is still dark, while things can still go wrong, while the salvation that they sing and proclaim is not yet fulfilled. We hear it too in Mary's song. The verbs she uses are all in the past tense. Did you notice that? Even though the deliverance she celebrates has not yet happened. The mighty have not yet been thrown down. The hungry have not yet been fed, and yet Mary sings it as if it is so. Elizabeth and Mary rejoice in God's promise, even though that promise has not yet been fulfilled. Perhaps that's the message of this third Sunday of Advent, of joy, that we can and should rejoice in the future God has promised and is bringing into the world, even while the world is still dark. Elizabeth says as much when she blesses Mary. She cries out, "Blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what was spoken to her by the Lord." Except that believed is not the best translation of that word, because believe is something you do in your head. The word Elizabeth uses is more like our word faith. It's a heart thing, a visceral thing, something you do with your whole body and soul. Blessed is she who has faith that God's promised goodness would be fulfilled. Elizabeth knows a thing or two about visceral, body and soul faith. She's just enacted it herself. When Mary walks in the door, the child in Elizabeth's womb leaps, and she asks, "Why has this happened, that the mother of my Lord has come to me?" And in this moment, Elizabeth becomes the first disciple. She is the very first person in all of the gospel to make a confession of faith, to proclaim that Jesus is Lord. Now, Elizabeth is 6 months pregnant. And as someone who also happens to be 6 months pregnant, let me remind you that at this point, those baby kicks and jumps are happening dozens of times a day. It's happened like 4 times in this worship service alone. And while every kick and jump is indeed cause for joy, they don't all mean that the Mother of God has just entered the room. What it does mean is that Elizabeth is doing the same thing as Mary. She is seeing signs of God's love and goodness and choosing to believe that they are true. Elizabeth knows that Mary is pregnant with the Lord because she faithed it. And upon witnessing these unlikely and inexplicable glimmers of God's goodness, Elizabeth chooses to rejoice. Friends, God invites us to do the same thing this Advent season. To have the faith to rejoice. Not to stick our heads in the sand and pretend that the present evil is not real, but to look the world in the eye and choose to celebrate the good news anyway. Christ is coming into the world. God is toppling the mighty and lifting up the lowly. God is filling the hungry with good things and sending the rich away empty. Love is being born. Even now, rejoice, rejoice, rejoice. Amen.